35. National Liberation Movement of the 30th-40th years. The uprising in Poland in 1831. Throughout the first half of the XX century, the cruel struggle of advanced people against serfdom and autocracy continued in Russia. Nicholas I throughout his reign sought to strangle the two most dangerous for him forces, peasant uprisings inside the country and the bourgeois revolution in Europe. The new upsurge of the bourgeois revolution in Europe was caused by the victory of the July Revolution of 1830 in France. Learning of this, Nicholas I gave the order to prepare a 250,000 army for a campaign in France. The uprising that began in Poland at that time relieved France of the possible intervention of Tsarism. Back in the late 20s of the XX century, in Warsaw, a secret society was organized from the pupils of the School of Underslaves, sub-lieutenants. Being influenced by the ideas of the French Revolution of 1830 and hoping for her help, they raised in November 1830 an uprising. The rebels set themselves the goal of secession of Poland from Russia and the formation of an independent state. Warsaw was in the hands of the insurgents, who seized the arsenal and armed the urban population. The dictator was General Klepytsky, a man of very moderate views. He belonged to that part of the gentry who occupied the highest posts in Poland and was against secession from Russia. Soon General Klepytsky resigned from his position as dictator. A new people's government was created, which also included representatives of the democratic sections of the small gentry. The new Diet was convened in December 1830. The most decisive act of the Seimas was the deposition of Nicholas, who under the Constitution of 1815 was the Emperor of the All-Russian and the King of Poland. To suppress the insurrection in Poland, Nicholas I sent a large army under the command of General Dibich. The Polish army, brought to 100,000 people, within 7 months successfully repulsed the onslaught of the Tsarist army. Soon, Dibich died of cholera. In Poland, General Paskevich was sent with a new army. August 26, 1831. Paskevich took Warsaw by storm and brutally dealt with the rebels. 5,000 noble families were exiled to the Caucasus, and their lands were confiscated. 260 students were sent to the soldiers. 30 women who took part in the uprising were forcibly tonsured into nuns. At the beginning of 1833, General Paskevich, appointed by the governor of Poland, reported to the Tsar, "Fear has already been directed to the edge." The Polish uprising of 1831 GG ended in complete defeat. One of the main reasons for this defeat was that the national gentry movement in Poland did not have the character of a national, political and social revolution. It was not combined with the peasant movement. Since the Szlachta did not want to give land to the peasants, it did not receive the support of the peasantry. According to Engels, it was a conservative revolution. The insurrection had no support in the masses and was crushed. The Constitution of 1815 was abolished, the Polish army dissolved, the University of Warsaw was closed. Strict censorship was introduced, all works of Polish writers were banned. Fleeing from persecution, the leaders of the uprising emigrated abroad. Rebellion in Belarus and Ukraine. The uprising from Poland was transferred to Lithuania, Belarus and Ukraine, but nowhere has it become a mass character. The commander of the Russian armies issued an order promising to release all those who would help the Tsarist army in the fight against the insurgents from serfdom. The peasants believed this promise and began to transfer to the side of the Tsarist government. The uprisings were suppressed here, too. All the nobles who actively participated in the uprisings confiscated the land, and the order with the promise of wool to the peasants was declared illegal. The uprising in Ukraine spread only to the right bank part, to the Kiev and Podolsk provinces. It seized only a few of the oppressed gentry. Ukrainian peasants did not support the uprising, considering it a matter of Ukrainian-Polish hands. Large Ukrainian and Russian landlords also did not support the uprising, since Tsarism satisfied their economic interests. Peasant movement in Ukraine. In the 30s of the XIX century, a broad peasant movement developed in Ukraine. It was caused by the intensified feudal and colonial oppression. The peasants refused to go to the corvée and carry other duties. The struggle of the peasants against the landlords and the Tsarist authorities in Podolia was especially stubborn. Here the struggle took the form of a partisan movement. The uprising was led by Ustim Karmliuk, an outstanding leader of the peasant movement against Polish, Ukrainian and Russian landlords. Karmliuk was born in the family of a poor peasant serf. He served in the courtyard, then for some misdemeanor was given to the soldiers, fled the regiment and organized a small peasant detachment attacking the landlords and rich farmers. In 1814, Mr. Karmliuk caught, punished with spitz boots and sent to a military command in the Crimea. Together with 4 soldiers he again fled and continued to struggle with the landlords. After the new arrest, the Tsarist court sentenced him to death, but replaced him with 10-year penal servitude. Karmliuk also fled from penal servitude and again began the struggle in Podolia, becoming the head of the peasant detachment and destroying the estates of the landlords. In the summer of 1827 the landlords again seized Karmliuk. When the peasants bound him by order of the landlords, Karmliuk addressed them with an angry speech. "Why do not you knit them, pans? Because they oppress you." He urged the peasants not to submit obediently to the yoke of serfdom. Together with Karmliuk, 750 peasants were brought to trial. Of these, 300 people were whipped and sent to Siberia, 180 were sent to the soldiers. In 1830, Mr. Karmliuk, for the 7th time, fled from the Siberian hard labor and led the struggle against the landlords. The extraordinary popularity of Karmliuk among the peasantry made him elusive. In every hut he had protection and shelter. In September 1835, during one of the raids organized by the landlords on Karmliuk, he was shot by some noblemen. However, for a long time Karmliuk's wave of peasant uprising against the landowners had not abated. Cholera riots and insurrections in the army. Peasants in all Russia rose to fight against serfdom. In the years 1830, 1831, the country was swept up by an epidemic of cholera. Moving from the Caucasus, it reached Moscow and St. Petersburg. Under the influence of rumors that the landlords poisoned the peasants with the deadly poison, disturbances began. Crowds of people in villages and cities attacked hospitals, often killed doctors. In the summer of 1831 an uprising broke out among the military settlers of the Novgorod province. The result of this uprising was the gradual elimination of military settlements. Particularly significant size took the rebellion of sailors, soldiers, artisans and other, simple people in Sevastopol in the summer of 1830. The cause of the uprising was an unbearable oppression in the Tsarist army and in the fleet. When the plague appeared in the Caucasus and Bessarabia, a strict quarantine was established in the city of Sevastopol and in the fleet. No one had the right to leave their home. The famine began in the city. In June 1830, people driven to despair, led by the sailor Timofey Ivanov, were struck to the alarm and raised an uprising. Workers and sailors of naval crews joined the rebels. The whole city was in the hands of the insurgents. Nicholas I brutally dealt with the Sevastopol rebels. 1580 soldiers, sailors and workers were betrayed to the military court. Every 10th was sentenced to death. Some were awarded 3,000 gavels, which also meant the death penalty. 375 women, wives and daughters of sailors and soldiers, were exiled to hard labor. The peasant movement in the 30s covered 26 provinces. It increased even more in connection with the crop failure, famine and fires that began in a number of cities and villages of the Volga region. The peasants regarded the landlords and officials as incendiaries and dealt with them. The growth of the mass movement in the country spoke of the increasing discontent of the masses with serfdom. The chief of the gendarmes Bankendorf anxiously reported to the Tsar, "The whole spirit of the people is directed towards one goal, liberation." He advised the Tsar to make concessions to the peasants. In 1842, a decree was issued on the rise of military settlers. Convict peasants for the collection of alms. Obliged peasants, who gave the landlords the right to grant personal freedom to the peasants, but obliged the peasants to serve the landowner with corvée or pay the rent. The new law did not change anything in the position of the peasantry. Therefore the peasantry continued to worry and demand liberation from serf bondage. The number of unrest increased. In 1826, 1834 years, there were 145 of them, and in 1845, 1854, 348. The peasants fled to the outskirts. Sometimes they ran all the villages. 36. Final conquest of the Caucasus. New war of Russia with Iran and Turkey. Conquest of the eastern and northern Caucasus. After the victorious outcome of the war with Napoleon, Tsarist Russia embarked on the final conquest of the Caucasus. The commander-in-chief in the Caucasus was General A. P. Ermolov. He put forward a plan for the systematic conquest of the northeastern Caucasus by erecting military fortifications, from which continuous military expeditions against mountain people were undertaken. Ermolov ordered to make clearings in the woods, saying that in the matter of pacifying the edge of the axe will play as important a role as a gun and bayonet. At the same time, individual local feudal lords were drawn to the Russian side. Ermolov made attempts to subjugate the region and peacefully. In the areas occupied by Russian troops, Ermolov introduced economic improvements, in particular, encouraged the development of sericulture, and promoted the spread of education, opening schools for the local population. He tried to regulate the land relations between local feudal lords and peasants. Under the fear of the death penalty, the sale of people to slavery was banned. The northeastern Caucasus was inhabited by fragmented, backward, small mountain tribes. They lived in two main areas, Dagestan and Chechnya. Most of these mountain nationalities experienced a stage of the disintegration of patriarchal tribal relations and only passed to feudalism. Chechnya was especially backward. The most developed and rich were Primorsky and South Dagestan, where feudalism prevailed and the role of trade was significant. The population of Dagestan was in different forms of dependence on local feudal lords. The peasant Yazdeni led the economy on the lands of the Beks from the share of the harvest. However, part of the bridles has already reached economic self-sufficiency and prosperity. In addition to the Yazdene, the local feudal lords, the Beks and the clergy, worked in the district. They were, in fact, serfs, deprived of the right to move from one village to another. Small and large feudal lords also had slaves kulas. Among the population there were often quarrels over land and pastures. These disputes and litigation were dealt with in Muslim law, which was established on the basis of custom. The custom of tribal revenge was preserved among the mountaineers. The Muslim clergy enjoyed an undivided influence on the mountain population. The dominant position in the feudal estates of Dagestan was occupied by Khans and Beks, princes. With the conquest of the Caucasus, some Khans and Beks transferred to the service of the Russian Tsar. Using the protection of the Tsarist authorities, they seized the lands of the tribal communities and turned them into serfs. This caused discontent among the mountain tribes and spontaneous indignations both against the Tsarist authorities and against their own Khans and Beks. The final conquest of the northeastern Caucasus was undertaken by the Tsarist government in the second quarter of the 19th century. It was connected with serious foreign policy complications that caused new wars between Russia and Iran and Turkey. The war between Russia and Iran, 1826-1828. The advance of Russia to the east, from the Caucasus, caused alarm and discontent of Shah Iran. England, fearful of strengthening Russia in the Middle East, secretly incited the Iranian Shah to a war against Russia. As early as 1814, the British concluded a military alliance with the Shah and sent their instructors to reorganize the Iranian army. Iran declared invalid the Gulistan Treaty, according to which the Khanates in Azerbaijan withdrew to Russia. At the same time, The British agents in the Transcaucasus and the Northern Caucasus began to prepare armed uprisings of the local population against Russia. In July 1826, the commander of the Iranian army, Abbas Mirza, with the 60,000-strong army crossed the Russian border. The new Iranian invasion led to the devastation of hundreds of Armenian villages. Thousands of Armenians were taken prisoner and stolen in Persia. Together with Abbas Mirza, escaped Khans returned who sought to subjugate the population of Armenia and Azerbaijan under the auspices of the Iranian Shah. The Armenian population saw in Russian their deliverers from the centuries-old Iranian yoke and supported Russian troops. General Ermolov assembled the army and began successful military operations. Ermolov managed to drive out Iranian troops from Transcaucasia in the first year of the war. But the Tsarist government did not trust Ermolov because of his connections with the Decembrists. The commander-in-chief and governor of the Caucasus was General Pozkivik. 37. Peoples of Middle Asia and the promotion of CARECOMS to Kazakhstan and Middle Asia Central Asian Khanates. Education. By the end of the X8th century, 3 Central Asian Khanates, Bukhara, Khiva and Kokand, was one of the important stages on the way to the political unification of Central Asia, fragmented before the many hostile feudal possessions. Under the rule of the 3 Khanates were Uzbeks, Tajiks, Kyrgyz and part of Turkmens. A significant part of Turkmenistan was considered under the sovereignty of Iran. The nomadic Turkmen economy did not have a solid fodder base and a sufficient number of water sources. Under the influence of extreme poverty, the Turkmen often raided settled settlements in Bukhara, Afghanistan and Iran. The nobility, provided with better land and irrigation canals, turned into the exploiting stratum of the population of Turkmenistan. A significant part of present-day Tajikistan at the beginning of the X6th century also maintained a formally independent existence and was ruled by local rulers. The Central Asian Khanates waged a continuous struggle to subjugate neighboring possessions. The most extensive conquests were in the Kokand Khanate. At the beginning of the X6th century, it subordinated to itself a large trading and strategic center of Central Asia, Tashkent. The conquest of Tashkent facilitated Kokand the subordination of the surrounding steppe Kazakh regions and Kyrgyzia. To strengthen their power, the Kokand Khans covered the territories of the southern Kazakh regions and Kyrgyzia with a network of fortresses, built mosques and madrasas, Muslim schools, implanting Muslim enlightenment. Shopping and handicraft urban settlements grew around the fortresses, Ak Mosque, Olaydia, Pishpek, etc. In the 30s of the X6th century, the Kokand Khanate was the largest state formation in Central Asia with borders from the Pamir foothills to the lower reaches of the Sirt area and to western China. Significantly expanded in the early X6th century, and the borders of the Khiva Khanate, which subjugated the neighboring lands of the Kazakhs, Turkmens and Karakalpaks. Khiva feudal lords fostered intertribal hostility among the Turkmen population. The boundaries of the Bukhara Khanate in the first decades of the X6th century, on the contrary, narrowed due to the growth of the Kokand and Khiva Khanates. Kokand was transferred to Turkestan, which was under the auspices of Bukhara, and many fortresses. Several Turkmen possessions have moved to Khiva. Despite its political weakness, Bukhara in the middle of the X6th century continued to play a further prominent economic role. In Bukhara lived the bulk of artisans, successfully competed with their cotton and silk products with all other cities. The class structure and administration of the Khanates were homogeneous. At their head stood the Uzbek feudal nobility and the higher Muslim clergy. The last farm did not lead and gave the land to the peasants from the share of the harvest. The main producers were peasants engaged in farming and cattle breeding. An exceptional role in the economy was played by the use of water, without which land in Central Asia does not represent value. If someone made irrigation works in previously dead lands, then these lands became his property. Kazakhs in the second quarter of the X6th century. Since the 20s of the X6th century, in the Kazakh steppes, A number of fortifications were established, with the help of which Tsarism sought to retain the obedience of the Kazakhs and intended to launch an offensive against the states of Central Asia. In 1837 years, Orenburg Governor-General Voporovsky began building a line of fortresses between Orsk and Troitsk, for which he cut off nomadic sites of 10,000 square kilometers rich in pastures, water and forests. The Kazakhs were pushed back to the poorly placed lands. The right to move around in fortress areas was limited. The violence and robbery of the Tsarist colonialists caused a just outrage among the Kazakhs. In order to weaken the resistance of the Kazakh people, Tsarism, even during the reign of Paul I, singled out Bukhay Khan's nomad from the younger Juz and created a special Bukhayevo Khanate, subject to Tsarist Russia. Part of the coast of the Caspian Sea, where the nomads of the Bukhayev Khanates were located, was declared the property of Russian landowners, who exacted exorbitant fees from Kazakhs for using pastures. Strengthening of the tax oppression and exploitation by the elders appointed by the Khan and enjoyed the support of Tsarism, the seizure of the land by the Khan and the Sultans caused a wide popular uprising in Bukhayevsky Horde, which began in 1836. At the head of this insurrection there were Sergeants Batarai Taimanov and the people's poet, Akin Makembry Udemisov. They besieged the Khan's stake, burned a lot of the Sultan's property and handed them over to the poorest Kazakhs. The uprising was a peasant war, simultaneously directed against Tsarism and its colonialist policies. It was crushed by the combined efforts of the Khans, Sultans and Tsarist authorities, along with progressive, anti-colonial, national liberation movements in the first half of the 19th century. In Kazakhstan there were protests against Tsarism, which had a reactionary, feudal monarchical character. The organizers and inspirers of them were representatives of the Kazakh feudal nobility, who for various reasons were dissatisfied with the policy of the Tsarist government. Their discontent especially increased after the liquidation in 1822 of the Khan's power. The large Kazakh feudal lords, strangled in their previous rights and privileges, began to struggle against Kazakhstan's annexation to Russia, for the restoration of the medieval Khanate power. This fight was first led by Sartsan Kasimov, and after his death, the brother of Sarjan Sultan Kanzeri Kasimov continued. Ablay's grandson Sultan Kanzeri considered the territory of Kazakhstan as a property of his Khanate family and dreamed of turning Kazakhstan back to the order that existed in the X8th century. In the Khanate of Ablay I, he used the dissatisfaction of the masses with the colonial policy of Tsarism in his narrow class interests. Initially, a fairly significant mass of workers joined the movement of Kanzeri Kasimov, but soon they became convinced that the power of Sultan Kanzeri does not bring them relief. Kanzeri wanted to preserve the unit, that is, the old customary law, seized cattle from the Kazakhs who did not want to obey him, and brutally dealt with all his displeased actions. Kanzeri fired an intergenerational struggle, setting one race against another. Achieving the Khanate power, Kanzeri agreed to vassal dependence on Russia and was in collusion with the Tsarist administration, seeking from the Tsarist generals land and ranks. At the same time, he fought against joining Russia and entered into negotiations with hostile Central Asian Khanates who were interested in expanding their influence in Kazakhstan by supporting Kanzeri. Subsequently, Kanzeri's son Kasimov, Sadat continued to fight against Russia and was in the service of the Central Asian Khans associated with the British. The movement of Kanzeri Kasimov, which lasted 10 years, 1837-1847, gradually weakened. Some of the Kazakh working people who joined him at first departed from him. The main support of the movement of Kanzeri and his armed force were feudal squads Kanzeri, as well as his relatives and other feudal lords. After a series of defeats, Kanzeri migrated to the eastern part of the steppe. Fatal for Kanzeri was his entry into the war with Kyrgyzstan. Kanzeri ruined and burned not only Kyrgyz feudal lords, but also the poor. This caused a general outrage of the Kyrgyz people against Kanzeri Kasimov. Soon Genzeri was captured by the Kyrgyz and executed. Thus, the movement of Genzeri Kasimov, who sought to restore Khan's power in Kazakhstan and tear Kazakhstan away from Russia, ended in complete failure. Promotion to Central Asia. Simultaneously with the struggle against Genzeri Kasimov, Russian Tsarism also prepared and conquered the Central Asian Khanates. Governor-General Perovsky organized a small army, backed by the Cossack, and also the Bashkir and Kazakh cavalry. With this army in the autumn of 1839, he came from Orenburg on a campaign against Khiva. 15,000 camels accompanied the detachment along the desolate steppes, carrying food and water for the expedition. However, snow blizzards and heavy frost destroyed the camels and horses and forced Perovsky to retreat with great losses. After this failure, Perovsky began preparing an offensive through the Kyrgyz steppe. Directions for roads were investigated, wells were digged, fortifications were built. On the Sirdary River, Aralsk Fort was built. Soon it became the center of a vast Russian agricultural colony along the shores of the Aral Sea, on which a steamship flotilla was built. Between Orenburg and the Aral Sea was arranged a permanent message. In the spring of 1853, Perovsky moved with considerable forces up the Sirdarya into the possession of the Kokand Khan. Perovsky besieged the Akhmast of Kokand, interrupted all its defenders and created there the Russian fortress of Perovsk. At the Sirdarya Perovsky built 5 new fortifications, the so-called Sirdarya Line. The Tsarist troops captured the cities of Pishpek, Tokmak and others. These cities, then belonging to the Kokand Khanate, were inhabited by the Kyrgyz. But Kyrgyzstan is a mountainous country and difficult to access, so its final subordination to Tsarist Russia happened later, only in the 60s. Continued promotion to Kazakhstan. In 1854 the fortification of Verno was founded, then the city of Verny, now Almaty. In 1854, Perovsky, from his base in the Sirdarya, launched a campaign against Khiva, but the Khiva Khan sent ambassadors to the Russian camp and concluded a treaty recognizing the supreme power of Russia and giving her advantages in trade with Khiva. Thus, by the end of the 1950s a common line of fortresses was established from Sirdarya to Semipalatinsk. The Kazakh and Kyrgyz steppes were in full power of Tsarism. The final submission to the Tsarism of the Central Asian Khanates, Khiva, Kokand and Bukhara, was only a matter of time. Chapter IX Cars, the European Standard. 38. NIKOLAI'S's Foreign Policy Eastern Question. The uprising of the Decembrists, the main cause of which Nicholas I considered the influence of the revolution in Europe, caused the Tsar to abandon the cautious, ambivalent and slow policy of Alexander I from the first days of his reign and to proclaim the new beginnings of the foreign policy of the empire. Energy, determination, onslaught. The main objectives of Nicholas I's foreign policy were the same as those of Alexander I, but his immediate goal was to establish the complete rule of Tsarist Russia in the Middle East. Being Russia's largest Black Sea power, Russia was interested in the free use of the straits, which represent the only way out of the Black Sea, and in the creation of such a regime in them that would not allow the states hostile to Russia to use the straits to attack the Russian possessions in the Black Sea region. But in the Middle East, Russia had powerful opponents: England, France and Austria. Austria sought to take control of navigation on the Danube and economically gain a foothold in the northwestern part of the Balkan Peninsula. France sought to tear off Egypt from Turkey. England wanted to turn Turkey into its semi-colony and into a barrier against the advance of Russia to the Mediterranean and the East. Therefore, Britain and France sought to seize control of the Black Sea Straits. Thus, in the Middle East, a bloc of competing states, England, France, Austria, supported Turkey against Russia. Thanks to the growing technical and economic backwardness of Russia, England managed to push its feudal rival from the markets. In the 1920s, England succeeded in destroying the Russian commercial and trade monopoly in the northern part of the Pacific Ocean. During the war between Russia and Turkey and Iran, for the possession of Transcaucasia, Great Britain waged intense subversive work against Russia. But England was especially jealous of the pretensions of Tsarist Russia towards Asia. The Near and Middle East became, thus, the key points of international contradictions and the source of the fierce foreign policy struggle of Tsarist Russia with its rivals. In the first years of his reign, Nicholas I tried to strengthen his influence on the Balkan Peninsula, supporting Greece in its struggle against Turkey for independence. England, however, deprived Tsarism of the results of this struggle, because it wrested Greece from under Russian influence by its ties with the Greek bourgeoisie and loans to the Greek government. During the Russo-Iranian War, 1826-1828 and the Russian-Turkish War, 1828-1829, Tsarist Russia again succeeded in increasing its influence in the Middle East. The Turkmenchay and Adrianople treaties marked the great successes of Nicholas I's foreign policy. The treaty, concluded in 1828 in Turkmenchay between Russia and Iran, gave Russia the opportunity to consolidate itself on the Caspian Sea. England stubbornly fought against the growth of Russia's influence in Iran and throughout the whole of Asia. A year later, with the active assistance of the English president, an uprising broke out in Tehran against Russia, during which almost the entire Russian mission, headed by the envoy poet Grigoriev, was killed. The Adrianople Treaty with Turkey in 1829 was profitable for Russia. The Bosporus and the Dardanelles were declared open to the passage of Russian and foreign merchant ships. The right of Russian citizens to trade freely within the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, was confirmed. Greece, Serbia, Moldavia, Wallachia was given wide autonomy. In fact, the Danube princedoms were occupied by the Russian army. But the powers of Europe, especially England, could not tolerate the predominance of Russia's influence in Turkey and were waiting for the opportunity to put an end to this influence. At this time, the situation of Turkey was complicated by the fact that the Egyptian ruler Muhammad Ali, supported by France, moved his army against her. The Turkish Sultan turned to Nicholas I for help. The Russian squadron, commanded by Admiral Lazarev, left Sevastopol to the shores of Turkey. In February 1833, Russian military vessels entered the Bosporus. Alarmed by the situation, England and France hastened to reconcile the recent opponents, the Turkish Sultan and the Egyptian Pasha, and then demanded the departure of the Russian squadron from Turkish waters. In an effort to destroy treaties that gave Russia great advantages in the Balkans, England convened a conference of interested countries in London in the summer of 1840, at which an agreement was signed on the question of Turkey between Britain, Austria, Prussia and Russia. The London Convention agreement placed Turkey under the collective defense of the four countries that had agreed. Because of this, Tsarist Russia was forced to abandon the dominant position in Turkey. But the growing revolutionary movement in Europe once again strengthened the leading role of Tsarism in international politics. All European governments sought help and protection from the revolution only from the gendarme of Europe. Nicholas I in autumn 1833 Austria, Russia and Prussia concluded an agreement on mutual assistance in case of external danger or the threat of revolution. This was the actual restoration of the Holy Alliance of the three feudal monarchs of Europe against the bourgeois revolution. When in 1846 an armed uprising of the Polish revolutionaries took place in Krakow, Austria and Russia sent troops to Krakow and routed the insurrection. But in February 1848 a revolution began in France, which soon assumed a pan-European character. 39. The Revolution of 1848 in Europe and interviews of Tsar Russia in Hungary. The leaders of the world proletariat K. Marx and F. Engels. The first independent performances of European workers, the uprising of the Lions Weavers in France, Chartism in England were defeated. The first civil war of the working class with the bourgeoisie in the summer of 1848 in Paris also ended in the defeat of the proletariat. The working class in this period was still young, weak and poorly organized in all countries. In Russia, the working class, like the capitalist industry, was in its infancy. However, the very fact of the emergence of a new social class, the proletariat, marked a new and most important epoch in the history of mankind. Leaders of the proletariat in the middle of the XX century were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marx was born on May 5, 1818 in Germany, in Trier, in the same Rhineland, in the city of Barmen. On November 28, 1820, Engels was born. In 1844 two great proletarian revolutionaries met and for almost 40 years worked hand in hand to liberate the workers and working people of the whole world. Marx and Engels discovered the world historical role of the proletariat as the creator of a communist society. Under their leadership, a proletarian party was created, which began to direct the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat. In 1847, Marx and Engels organized the first Communist Party, the Union of Communists. At the same time, they developed the program of the International Party of the Proletariat, the Manifesto of the Communist Party. There was a winter bad weather. From the rains the earth turned into a continuous mud. Russian soldiers were frozen in light uniforms. There were not enough shells and gunpowder. Food and fodder were brought in irregularly. The wounded were dying because of a lack of doctors and medicines. Nevertheless, the defenders of the fortress did not lose their courage and, despite the hardship, heroically resisted. The streets of the city were covered with barricades. Many houses turned into fortifications. The soldiers undertook brave nocturnal attacks and made bold outings. When night came, hundreds of volunteer hunters emerged from the fortress stealthily, occupied all the deepenings, arranged coverings and struck the enemy with unexpected and accurate fire. Very often behind the line of fortifications fierce bayonet fights were played out. Amazing bravery was different. For example, the sailor cat, who many times at night crawled to the strengthening of the enemy and suddenly started point-blank shooting at the enemy. During these 11 months of the agonizing siege, the iron endurance and firmness of the Russian soldiers showed up, with a calm mind, without grumbling and complaining of their duty. Among the defenders of Sevastopol was Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy. In his Sevastopol Tales, he depicted with great artistic force and truthfulness the heroic days of the defense of Sevastopol. A major role in the quality of the surgeon and organizer of the medical case was played by Anna Pirogov, an outstanding Russian scientist. Dasha Sevastopolskaya, the daughter of a sailor soldier, was the world's first Sister of Mercy in the war. In early 1855, the struggle took on an even more intense character. In March and May Allies repeated the hurricane bombardment of the fortress. Soon they undertook the storming of Sevastopol. Having received new reinforcements and new weapons, the attackers moved them to storm the Malakov Barrow. Through subversive operations, the Allied forces were able to approach the Russian fortifications considerably. From a distance of 150 meters they bombarded Sevastopol with shells. The besieged fought heroically, losing 500 to 700 people a day. The best organizers of the defense were killed: Kornilov, Nakhimov and Istomin. In the beginning of August, the fifth bombing began, and on August 27, September 8, after a new storm of fire, powerful assault columns rushed to Malakov Kurgan. After destroying almost all the fortifications with artillery fire, the French captured the Malakov Mound. The slopes of the mound were strewn with cores. Malakov Kurgan was taken, but the remaining bastions continued to defend themselves. The hopelessness of the situation forced the garrison, having blown up the powder cellars and buildings of the city, to go to the north side. After the glorious 349 days of defense of Sevastopol, his defenders retreated from the city, destroying all military supplies and sinking the last remnants of the fleet. In the Caucasus theater, the war with Turkey was successful. The Russian army took Kars by storm, from where the road towards Ural opened. But the Caucasian front could not have a decisive influence on the outcome of the war. The Crimean War was lost. Nicholas I died before the end of the war, in February 1855, and the peace treaty was signed by his son Alexander II, who came to the throne after the death of his father. In February 1856, the sessions of the International Congress on the conclusion of peace began with the participation of Russia, Britain, France, Austria, Turkey, and Sardinia in Paris. The most intransigent position at the Congress was held by England. She demanded that Russia not restore military fortifications on the Åland Islands and the Black Sea, destroy the naval arsenal in Nikolaev, and not keep the navy in the Black and Azov Seas. France took a more conciliatory position, fearing excessive strengthening of England. According to the peace treaty concluded in Paris in 1856, Tsarist Russia was deprived of the right to have military ships in the Black Sea, and fortresses on the coast. The southern part of Bessarabia was transferred to Turkey. The Ottoman Empire was guaranteed integrity and independence. But Serbia, Moldavia and Wallachia were placed under the protection of European powers. The Dardanelles and the Black Sea were declared neutral and accessible for navigation by merchant ships of all countries. Tsarist Russia lost its command role in international politics. The reason for Russia's defeat in the Crimean War. The Crimean War brought Russia huge losses killed, wounded and dead from various diseases. Military expenses were very high. The ruin caused by the war was also very significant. Russia's foreign trade shrank almost fourfold. Agriculture and industry were upset. The defeat of Tsarist Russia in the Crimean War was caused by deep economic reasons. According to the description of Marx and Engels, the Crimean War was a hopeless struggle of the nation with a backward mode of production against nations with the newest forms of social and economic relations. The war revealed the advantages of capitalism in front of the feudal serf system. The defeat of Tsarism in the Crimean War was the result of Russia's economic, military and political backwardness. At the beginning of the Crimean War, both sides, both Russia and the Allies, were not prepared for war. But the Allied troops had already been reorganized since the spring of 1855. Meanwhile, the collapse in the Russian army was increasing. Tsarist Russia did not have sufficient military industry. The military plant built in the 1940s was inactive in Kerch. The military iron foundry planned for construction was never opened in Moscow. Kamenskoye military plant in the Urals gave guns, which were torn already during the trial tests. Tsarist Russia during the Crimean War almost had no railways. All transportation was carried out on the carts requisitioned from the peasants. The delivery of bread from Perekop to Sevastopol took many months. The Allies also conducted a railway from Balaklava to Sevastopol and secured for themselves rapid transfers of troops and supplies. The armament of the Russian army, compared with the armies of England and France, was backward. Russian soldiers fired from flintlock guns, which hit only 300 paces. To load a gun, from the barrel, the soldier stood up to his full height. The guns fired a 300 pitched grapeshot and 600-pound cores. The internal organization of the army of Nicholas also testified to its backwardness. The recruits were shaved with foreheads. They were brought to the military units as prisoners. The service life was determined at 25 years. The soldier could get a vacation and see his family only after 15 years of service. The regiments were cumbersome and little adapted to combat operations. While in the Allied armies the loose order was already practiced, the Tsarist army still went on the offensive with solid columns, representing a convenient target for enemy artillery. The Crimean War was waged in the midst of a complete internal disorganization of the administration and leadership of the Russian army. The bureaucratic military apparatus gave conflicting orders. The troops in the Crimea did not even have maps and plans. Sales, embezzlement, direct robbery of soldiers' food and uniforms by intendants and military officials, lack of medical assistance and medication, all this complemented the picture of the complete inability of Tsarism to fight the advanced capitalist armies. One of the reasons that led to the defeat was the deep discontent prevailing in the country and in the army. Throughout the Crimean War, peasant unrest grew in the country. In 1854, The peasant movement captured 10 provinces. In the spring of 1855 there was a set in the militia. Hundreds of thousands of peasants went to join the militia, as there was a rumor that the volunteers would be freed from serfdom. The rumor was not confirmed. Peasants revolted in masses. Marx and Engels emphasized that Russia cannot raise its military strength without making a complete revolution in its entire internal social and political organization and, especially, in its production. K. Marx and F. Engels, Collected Works, Volume 8, p. 462. Lenin wrote that, the Crimean War showed the rottenness and impotence of serfdom. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 17, p. 95. Defeat in the Crimean War put Tsarist Russia in front of the need to abolish serfdom. In that, however, this defeat of Russia led to the decline of the leading role of Russian Tsarism, which he played on the continent of Europe in 1815–1853. The Russian Empire, in view of its backwardness, was distinguished at that time by the absence of deep internal contradictions in its military feudal system. This circumstance informed Russia of the power and ensured its leading position on the continent of Europe. Unlike the West, Russia did not have a developed and politically mature bourgeoisie. The working class as a revolutionary force in Russia did not yet exist. The multi-million Russian peasantry, which was an inexhaustible source of manpower for the state, was in the position of an unconscious and uncultured enslaved mass. The scattered outbreaks of peasant uprisings could not seriously weaken the strength of the Tsarist police, army and bureaucracy. Tsarist Russia, with its obedient army, with its diplomacy, was the gendarme of Europe, a bogeyman for the revolutionary and national liberation movements in Europe. When Nicholas I. This influence of Russia reaches its highest limit. History of Diplomacy, Volume I, p. 299–300. 41. Tsarism in the Far East. The defeat of Tsarism in the Crimean War, as a result of which Russia lost the opportunity to gain a foothold in the Middle East, once again set the Pacific problem on the order of the day. Back in the early 1940s, the Middendorf expedition, sent by the Academy of Sciences to Siberia, penetrated the Amur region, was convinced that it was not occupied by China, and had established relations with the indigenous population of the Amur-Gileaki. The survey of the mouth of the Amur was entrusted to the Russian-American company, but the representatives of this company, as well as the head of foreign policy in the reign of Nicholas I. Nesselrode, were negative about the consolidation of Russia's influence on the Amur. The expedition did not reach the mouth of the Amur. Based on the results of this negligently conducted expedition, Nesselrode wrote in his report to the Tsar, "Sakhalin is a peninsula, it has no Cupid, it does not matter to Russia." On the basis of this report, the question of the Amur River as a river, supposedly not associated with the southern seas of the Pacific Ocean, was abandoned. But in the late 1940s one of the Russian naval officers, Nevelskoy, using the support of the East Siberian Governor-General Muravyov, equipped an expedition on the brig Baikal from Petropavlovsk to the eastern shore of Sakhalin. In September, when the brig was already deemed dead, he appeared in Ian Bay, returning from the island of Sakhalin. Sakhalin is an island. The entrance to the Amur River is possible for sea vessels from the north and from the south. The age-old error is scattered, Nevelskoy reported. Nevelskoy's discovery was not approved by the government, Nevelskoy himself, for violating the Tsar's order, which banned the expedition, was tried and demoted from the officers. Only after the troubles of Muravyov Nevelskoy was allowed to establish a winter residence on the southeastern shore of the Sea of Okhotsk and raise the Russian military flag at the mouth of the Amur River. From this time, energetic colonization of the banks of the Amur began, cities began to be founded, Cossacks and peasants began to move here. In 1858, China signed the Treaty of Aigon on behalf of the city in which it was signed, which gave Tsarist Russia the left bank of the Amur River. The Ushuri region remained in joint use of Russia and China. In 1858, Khabarovsk was founded. In the winter of 1860, the Treaty of Aigun was confirmed by the Treaty of Peking, which extended vast expanses from the Ushuri River to the Pacific Ocean, on the shore of which the Vladivostok Fortress was erected, 1860, and where the navy was transferred. During this period, the Tsarist government began negotiations with the United States of America on the sale of its American colonies, Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. Tsarism considered it unfavorable for the further exploitation of its distant American colonies, the protection of which represented great difficulties. In 1867, contrary to Russia's interests, the Tsarist government sold Alaska along with the Aleutian Islands for $7 million to the United States of America.